trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rock, for the tree to drop. Here is a strange and bitter cry.
Good evening and welcome. I am Lois Rosado, and I am a member of the Prince George's County Lynching Memorial Project. This is the second of our series on combating lynching in America. I would like to begin by introducing Lulu Beatty, who is a psychologist and co-secretary of the Prince George's County Lynching Memorial Project, who is going to share information about what we do, who we are, and what we do. Good evening, Lula.
Good evening, Lois. I'm so pleased to be here and introduce you to the Prince George's County Lynching Memorial Project, which is a co-sponsor of this exciting webinar. Next slide, please. We are a diverse, volunteer, grassroots organization that was formed in March of 2019. We work to advance the cause of reconciliation in our county by documenting the history of racial terror lynchings, advocating for public acknowledgement of these murders, and working to honor and dignify the lives of the victims. Our mission is to educate the public on the truths of our nation's continuing legacy of slavery, to memorialize victims of racial terror lynchings in our county, and to advance the cause of racial justice and reconciliation through mutual support and collaboration. Nearly 6,500 racial terror lynchings have been documented in America between 1865 and 1950. At least 40 of those were in Maryland, 4 of which occurred in Prince George's County. Many, many more men and women are likely to have been lynched, but of which we have no records. They are lost to history. 4 Prince George's County Black men were murdered by lynching. No one was held accountable. We called their names: Thomas Jurix in 1869, John Henry Scott in 1875, Michael Green in 1878, and Stephen Williams in 1894. The PGCAAMCC seeks to confront Prince George's County's history of racial violence by collaborating with communities to memorialize victims of racial terror lynchings through a variety of community remembrance projects, such as soil collection ceremonies at the site of lynchings, historical marker placements, racial justice contests, and other community engagement programs like this webinar. Through programs such as these, we hope to foster honest, truth-filled, meaningful dialogue about past and present racism and to work toward justice today. Next slide, please. We hope you will choose to work with us for racial justice. This slide shows some ways, some current ways for you to get involved. In concert with the Equal Justice Initiative, we are sponsoring a racial justice essay contest. It is open to 9th through 12th grade students attending public high schools in Prince George's County. The submission deadline is February 15th. Scholarships up to $5,000 will be awarded. In co-sponsorship with the Prince George's County chapter of the NAACP and Joe's Movement Emporium, we are sponsoring a racial justice creative arts contest. It is open to students in grades 9 through 12. They can be in public, private, or homeschooled students. Scholarships totaling $3,000 or more will be awarded to winning participants. The submission is February 15th. Please contact us through our website if you're interested in helping us to plan a soil collection ceremony to honor Mr. Thomas Jurix, who was lynched in Piscataway in 1869. Next slide, please. This slide shows you all the ways that you can contact us and stay abreast of our activities. To join us or just be added to our listserv, and we really hope that you will join us, please email us or submit your information on the Contact Us page at our website. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube. And please help spread the word about our organization, the Prince George's County Lynching Memorial Project. Thank you.
And now I'd like to introduce Ms. Jody Wildy. Jody is the representative of the PG County NAACP, and she will introduce our moderator.
Good evening. My name is Jody Wildy, as Lois mentioned, and I am the Outreach and Membership Coordinator for Prince George's County NAACP. I'd like to introduce Mr. William Ford. Mr. Ford is a writer for the Washington Informer newspaper, who mainly covers Prince George's County government and some of the other happenings within the county. At this point, I'd like to let Mr. Ford tell a little about himself and what he covers within Prince George's County. Mr. Ford.
Good evening. As Ms. Wiley said, I cover a lot of Prince George's County government and also do some state coverage of what's going on in the government. As you know, there's a 90-day session going on in Annapolis. So if you don't know, now you do. And pay attention to some of the policies that also go on, which I will mention in some of the questions for some of our excellent panelists to discuss.
Thank you. Now we will show a short video by showing the NAACP president, Mr. Derek Johnson.
Lynching is not just hanging someone by a noose. Lynching is the public killing in many ways of an individual who has not received any due process. The history of lynching in this country is the backdrop of how the NAACP was started 112 years ago, where individuals will go to the town square and there will be a public lynching of African Americans. And during this time period, there was on average a person being lynched every day. And it was a public spectacle. What we witnessed with George Floyd was that same public spectacle. Someone in broad daylight with onlookers around being killed at the hands of a law enforcement officer who has just complete disregard for human life and felt he was above the law. That should not be the standard today, as it should not have been the standard 112 years ago. That will be something we continue to fight against, because we believe this nation could be a better nation if we hold people accountable to a standard of decency and dignity. What is so important for all of our communities, particularly Black and Brown communities, that the public policy landscape assures a heightened level of trust in the law enforcement agencies that serve them. We must create a different standard of safety in those same communities, and that can only be done through public policy. We have to enact federal public policy as a floor to do away with qualified immunity. If there's no accountability, you have people who will cause harm. We must ensure that law enforcement officers who are bad actors are not able to go from agency to agency causing harm on many different communities. So there has to be a federal registry that's public facing to ensure that's not taking place. We must look at this scenario by each jurisdiction, but have a federal public policy landscape to protect our communities so we can rebuild trust in law enforcement agencies, so communities can in fact be safe, and we can all be a healthier society as a result of it.
And that was from Derek Johnson, president of the NAACP National Chapter. And now Mr. Ford will introduce all of our panelists.
Thank you. I will start in this order. Mia X, president of the Greater DC Chapter, National Action Network. Samantha Master, she represents Life After Release. DaJuan Gay, Alderman, Ward 6, City of Annapolis. Ashanti Martinez, community advocate. And Gabriel Greaves, Prince George's County African American Museum and Culture Center. If we could, usually love to start with ladies first, because that's the polite thing to do. If Mia X or Samantha Master, if you could give a short introduction of yourselves, please.
Sure. Greetings, everyone. I bring you greetings from Baltimore City, where I'm currently located, but I'm a child of PG County and a child of Somerset County, Maryland. I am the director of movement building with Life After Release, an abolitionist-based organization to abolish our current carceral system in the United States, which is based in PG County.
Thank you, Ms. Mia X.
You're muted.
I beg your pardon. Thank you. My name is Nia 2X, and I am your humble servant president here in the DMV of the Greater DC Chapter National Action Network. I've been elected. This is our 7th year. The present board that we have, and we're here to serve, we're here to help. We're so grateful to be here on this forum. We think it's very necessary. and we're here to help in any way we can to continue the work that you've already started. Thank you for the invite.
Thank you, Nia 2X, excuse me. Thank you, man. Alderman Gay, if you could give a few words about yourself, sir.
Excuse me, I hope you all can hear me. Excited to be here and just really engage in dialogue. As he mentioned, I'm DaJuan Gay, city councilman in Annapolis, Maryland, representing the 6th Ward. But I think the invite was extended to me for this in particular. I had an opportunity to work closely on House Bill 307 with Jocelyn Penna-Melnick, which passed in 2019 and kind of got the ball rolling and opened up some necessary funding for these placards and monuments across the state. And so really excited to be here.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Greaves, if you can give a few words about yourself, sir.
My pleasure. My name is Gabriel Greaves. I am a very avid teacher activist. I've done this for several decades. My capacity was the Programs and Education Coordinator for the Prince George's African American Museum and Cultural Center for the last 3 years. And we had the privilege of doing work with PGCAAMCC this last year in regards to the school system, Prince George's County Public Schools, where we talked about racial reconciliation through the racial reconciliation and understanding the need to know our racial history in our local counties and our national history as well. I'm also a representative for the National Council of Elders, which is an intergenerational movement working with several from Aljosia Aldrich Harding, wife of the late Dr. Vincent Harding, to Sonia Sanchez and several others who were part of the Black freedom struggle in the 60s. And we do a lot of work with helping people to raise awareness on historical movements to document the struggle and to help others see what it looks like today.
Thank you, sir. And Mr. Ashanti Martinez, Prince George's County resident, community advocate, please, a few words from you, sir.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ford. And good evening, everyone. I'm Ashanti Martinez. I'm a community advocate. I'm a policy analyst. I'm also a candidate for Maryland House of Delegates, but most importantly, I'm a son of Prince George's County. And I'm really, really excited to be part of this conversation. It's a very timely conversation. I thank the NAACP Prince George's County chapter, as well as the Prince George's Lynching Memorial Project for the invitation. And I'm really looking forward to the dialogue we have today and what comes from that. So thanks.
All right, let's ask a few questions. Let's get some chatting going on. Now, some young people may see the word lynching and define it as something that happened, let's say, decades ago when some of their parents weren't even born. How do each of you define modern day lynching for youth and young adults, and even some of our older adults who may not understand it? Anyone can jump right in.
Well, modern day lynching and comparing it to, I'm gonna start off comparing it to lynching from the 1800s, 1700s, or ever since we've been here. The big difference is it was legal to lynch back in the day. It was under law. You could lynch a person. You could make these postcards with people being lynched. The law backed up that horrible practice. The law, the courts, the church even, it was an acceptable practice to do this barbaric and practice this horrible part of the society. Today, it's still lynching, and still the courts are attempting to help and support. It's a little different when we look at the recent Ahmaud Arbery. We get a little hope because it took 11 whites and 1 Black to finally convict based on evidence and humanity. But the practice is still alive. The practice is still strong. The practice is still being planned because you can be lynched right in the courts. You go to get a fair trial and you get there and basically you're lynched. Sometimes the prosecutor, the judge, and the defense attorney are all in cahoots together. That's a kangaroo lynching. So we know it still exists, but the big difference for myself, it was sanctioned by law in the past, and now it's sanctioned, but it's not just on the books.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Greaves, if you want to jump in.
To be truthful, the topic is a bit unnerving at points when looking at the reactions of white America. And I tend to define lynching based on the intended goal that white people have said to me. Here's why I say that. Of course, I could say that lynching in America is the murder and death of Black people, but that is the physical form of lynching. I look at the intended outcome that many white Americans have openly said when it came to displaying racial terrorism. When you see a circulation in history of pictures and photographs, and now in social media, videos of Black people that have been harassed, that have been bullied, that have been murdered outright, you can't help but notice that many are used to talking about the issue without actually doing anything about it. And so, and I also noticed in these spaces that many are used to, in progressive circles to be more specific, they're used to saying, we feel so sorry for all the African Americans and Indigenous Americans who have been harmed by racial terrorism, but they don't do anything. And so when I think about lynching, what I see is a state of mind. I see a state of mind in which people normalize the murder of Black and brown bodies, but they also normalize the spectacle of witnessing Black and brown bodies and celebrating white guilt, which just celebrates feeling bad about a situation that can be changed while they never do anything. I also think about Black and brown youth in particular, who have quite literally been subjugated to trauma by constant exposure to the violation of Black and brown bodies, but they're not really exposed to the fact that Black people have value and that they can actually win. And that's why lynching has always relied on breaking down the confidence of Black and brown peoples over time, so that we will be stuck in a constant state of trauma without ever actually dealing with the root of it.
And I want to jump in with how I define lynching in this moment. And I think that this is true both historically and in this moment. I saw someone in the chat saying cancel culture is a form of lynching. It is not. That is not true. And Dave Chappelle should not be our litmus test for cancel culture or lynching. But I do believe that lynching is the public killing of people to either instill fear, to maim, to terrorize, or to assert and reinforce power.
Thank you. Ashanti, you jump right in, sir. Go for it.
Yeah, for me, I think when I think about modern day lynching, I still think about it as the extrajudicial killing of Black and brown people. It's saying that we're guilty well before we get a trial, well before we get any verdict. Just because of who we are and where we come from, we automatically are seen as criminals. We're automatically seen as at fault for things that our white neighbors get to say that we're at fault for. And it's something that we see every single day. President Johnson on the video we saw prior to this conversation talked about, some policy changes like qualified immunity. Police officers in this country have a whole different set of rules. And one of them is that they get to kill us, and it's okay. They don't get to be charged for that at the same way if we killed each other. And so it's definitely something that's still very much sanctioned. And I don't think we even fully realize it because we've been conditioned to just operate under that system.
But I want to trouble this water, right? To say that even though it is extrajudicial, it is also very much legal, right? So it's even there were lynchings that happened as a result of trials that were shams. So it's the extrajudicial, but it's also the ways that the courts are able, the political apparatus of the day is able to sanction, to reinforce, to make it okay, right? For bodies to be publicly disposed of. For Black and brown and Indigenous bodies to be publicly disposed of specifically.
If I
Thank
can,
go ahead. I was going to get Alderman Gay in real quick, just so he can jump in, and then Mr. Greaves, then you'll jump. As soon as Alderman Gay finishes, jump right in, sir. This conversation, let's keep it moving.
I agree, definitely great conversation, but I would agree with the panelists. I think that you can look at it through two lenses. Obviously, the physical, more brutal sense of the term lynching. And I think for me, the most bizarre recently, obviously, is Ahmaud Arbery. I think just to be hunted down, to be, just murdered like that in broad daylight, it is, just a classic case of lynching. But then you can also look at it metaphorically through the criminal justice system, as some of the panelists have mentioned, and some of the, cases of notoriety that have really tested the limits of how we can trust the criminal justice system and what it gives to us as Black people. And so I think there are definitely two senses of the term. And right now we're in an age where we're seeing it all vaguely through our criminal justice system, or even through social media, as I think Mr. Greaves mentioned.
Mr. Graves, I saw you were going to jump in. Go ahead, sir. Go for
it. Yes, I just wanted to add on to this point that the book, the Making of a Slave, I believe that's the name of the book by Willie Lynch, really lays out directly what the history of lynching was meant to instill. All forms of racial terrorism were meant to break the spirits and the minds of the enslaved African American, the enslaved Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Indigenous, and further. And the reason I say that is a reference to keep in mind is because you'll notice in social media, again, with the spectacle dynamic, you'll notice that they'll often portray a variety of Black and brown bodies that never got justice. Botham Sim Jean, going to church, coming home, and shot in his own home. And then right after that, there was Breonna Taylor, same situation. Prior to that, there was a young male, I believe, who was a cello player, and he was murdered. The list goes on, but you see the spectrum of people, often people of prominence, who are murdered, just like people who were on different levels. And all that is meant to portray an image in our minds that no matter who you are, what your status is in life, if you are a Black person, if you are an African-American person, and the powers that be deem you to be strong, they will come for you, make you a target, and then let you not get justice, to send a message to all of us that there can be no justice. And unfortunately for Native Americans, it's the same dynamic that happened to them as well, when they were subjugated to all manner of evils, all manner of settler colonialism and violence through terrorism, but they were never given justice. And they were exposed to a continual portrayal of broken spirits. That does something after 7 generations, and it's important for us to remember that.
And the underlining factor, the fuel that keeps it going from their perspective, from the open enemy's perspective, is fear. It is fear. It is the fear they used back in the day. How would you like riding down the street and you see bodies swinging from a tree? It sends the signal, as the brother is saying, and the other panelists are saying, without words, stay in your place in, or else this could be you or your family, and they would lynch you legally for stupid reasons. You look the Caucasian in his eye. He's walking down the street, you're walking down the street. In the South, it was customary. In the Southern states, after the signing of the Lincoln document, it was customary. If you were walking down the street and a Caucasian was walking down the street, you better get in the street and let that person have the sidewalk. So the whole problem, the whole episode of how they use and continue to use against our people and people of color is fear. Because if you have fear, then you have put a mental chain on your mind. They didn't do it, you did it, we did it. And we get the message in capital letters: stay in my place, keep quiet, my head down, don't buck the system, this, that, and the other. It's not working, not with these young people today. You can look at this panel, I can hear the panel. This is a different courage of people today, and I'm so honored that they're here. They call them the millennials. They say they're millennials, but honey, there's some sharp, intelligent, strong-willed, determined people to keep our liberation march moving forward. But it's the fear factor that was in the past and the fear factor that is still being pushed out today. Now, whether it's working or not, I would say it's not. It is quickly crumbling and not having the same effect it did when lynching was legal.
You know, one of the things that
before you go on, Samantha, I'm sorry, before you go on, before you go on, I was actually going to jump to another question, and I was going to start with you. So please stay right there. What ideas and any practices that you and your organization originate from past actions in combating lynching, please?
I'm glad we were on the same page, because I wanted to elevate that. I hear a lot of people talking about Ahmaud Arbery and the absolutely devastating and tragic end of his life by being hunted by 2 white men in Georgia. And I'm called to mind constantly. I did some work with Black Women's Blueprint in New York about Mary Turner, who is a Black woman who was lynched. She was 8 months pregnant. They killed her husband. They lynched Mary. They cut her baby out of her womb and stomped it to death. And so I want to make sure that we are very clear that Black women have been not only the advocates, the voices, the mobilizing forces often behind Black men who are lynched, but we too have also been the victims of this heinous violence. And so as we move into the 21st century, the work that we do at Life After Release is we call ourselves abolitionists. And people kind of hear abolitionists and they're like, well, the slaves were freed in 1865, girl, what you doing? And the reason we call ourselves abolitionists is because we very much see our current carceral system. I don't call it a criminal justice system. It's not just. It is a criminal legal system. It is a carceral system, right? Carceral meaning to lock up, but it's not just in any way. And the work that we do as modern day abolitionists is to make a direct connection between the institution of enslavement and the ways that Black bodies are still being locked up, jailed, enslaved, disposed of, killed, like Breonna Taylor and Ayanna Grant, and the slews of Black women who have been killed by police, who have been not organized around. And so as we are doing this work here in PG County, we are very much pulling from the people like Ida B. Wells, who I think is our first data scientist, right? She's like going around documenting these not just the BS reasons for people being lynched, but she is recording the names, she's interviewing families. And in this moment, we are doing similar work. We are working to, if you have an incarcerated loved one, we are working to get them out of the system. If you are a person who has collateral consequences, meaning you can't get a job, you can't get an apartment, you can't get into school, we are working with folks to reclaim their humanity after they've been dehumanized by this system very much based in enslavement.
Thank you. Alderman Gray, you can jump in as an elected official. How can you help from your seat in preserving and passing certain policies that don't affect and harm Black people?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think in particular, like, just being young, I'm 24 years old, and a lot of my friends who are even semi-engaged in, politics or just paying attention have completely given up on the system. And I have to remind them constantly not to give up on democracy. And I know people are like, oh, we've been in this forever. And it's like, but that's the only way we can get over it. And I think, being in elected positions give us the authority to do those things, to cut the budgets for, programs, as she just mentioned, that focus on empowering our youth and our communities. Somebody has to advocate for budgets, so I think you can take advantages of the spaces and opportunities and create legislation to affect your communities in a good way, similar to the work that Jocelyn Penna-Melnick's office did and her staffers Edith and Gail passing HB 307 to open up the conversation on lynching in the past here in Maryland. So I definitely think there is just an opportunity to utilize the resources, in particularly finances. I make that a big effort into helping our communities.
And Ashanti, can you jump right behind him? And then Mr. Greaves, please.
Yeah, no, I think, the Alderman spoke directly to a lot of the work that I do as an advocate. At CASA, I'm a policy analyst, but I also do community advocacy work through PG Changemakers and civic associations in my community. And I think, there is one level of folks in this work who are abolitionists who very much want to see a different structure, a different way. I see myself somewhere where I just believe in harm reduction. How can we get to a space where we create a system that we reduce the harm that Black and brown bodies feel from our system? How does that look? How does that manifest? I don't fully know, but I know what it looks like to reduce that harm, right? And there's multiple different ways we can do that. And that's always been my objective, is how can we use government? How can we use policy as a tool to reduce harm in communities? And that's through working together. That's through collaboration with organizations. That's just meeting the needs of individuals. The COVID pandemic has been a lot for all of us. I think we all are aware. And just simply being there for your neighbors really helps people understand that there is so much more that we can do together. And so for me, it's just from a place of harm reduction and trying to make sure that we're meeting our needs of our communities.
Go for it, Mr. Graves. Jump right in, sir.
I want to add on to those following comments by noting that if the nature of lynching is meant to induce fear and continual paralysis in African Americans and non-white Americans, then the reality is that the reasoning behind lynching also includes a fear of reprisal, a fear of resistance, a fear of being victorious. And I mention that because part of the work that we do, that I've done, in historical documentation, is helping people to see the history of slave resistance in local areas. You can never combat lynching without talking about those who lost their lives because they actually said this is wrong and because it actually returned fire with fire. Now, that may make some uncomfortable, but the fact of the matter is that even in Prince George's County, there are extensive history of resistance to enslavement, both after the Emancipation Proclamation and what happened later on, 2 years later, when Maryland finally succeeded in making laws to end slavery because they kept it going. I'm reminded of Poplar Neck and the Prince George's slave conspiracy site, in particular with Jack Ransom. That's in Brandywine, if I'm not mistaken. But he led a resistance, and though he did not succeed, he led a resistance movement against the plantation in that area. And people in Maryland, across Maryland, were fearful of that particular insurrection spreading. And so he lost his life. But the fact remains, lynching also includes murdering people by any means necessary when they said no to white supremacy. And so for us to encourage young adults and older adults, we have to tell those stories of how we resisted. There are 300 plus rebellions in US history alone. And yet the narrative nowadays is solely on the ways that African Americans and again, people of color were oppressed. You don't hear about how we fought back. Nat Turner also comes to mind in regards to people who are in Prince George's County, but have roots in the Chesapeake area in Virginia. Several indigenous tribes actually lost their land because they were accused of harboring runaway enslaved African Americans. And many of those tribes, unfortunately, became complicit in keeping their land by giving up those who were enslaved, and those who were enslaved suffered bad fates. However, there were other tribes that said, no, they're one of us. And as a result, land loss happened and lynchings happened against them as well, all because people were fearful in the system of resistance. And so for me, it's important to note not just that lynchings happened, it's important to note where they happened and all the ways that our people resisted. It's important to note also with burial practices, why it matters to know where the lynchings occurred so we can do proper burials, because part of white supremacy's part of the goal of white supremacy was to erase the significance of African and African-American practices. Burial practices are very critical in the African experience, to know where your ancestors are and to make sure that they are connected with the communities that happened before them. So part of our resistance to lynching in American history was for us to know where our people were, and then to constantly celebrate them and to call their names and to make clear to the powers that be that they will not be forgotten. That's why in the US history and the school systems, it is powerful when students are exposed to the names of victims of racial terrorism, and they're also exposed to the names of those who resisted, so that this won't repeat itself.
Mr. Greaves, you were flowing, and I was going to ask you a historical question. You kind of touched on it. I can tell as a teacher, I like to flow with it, and that is just fine. Ms. Nia 2X, I want you to jump in for this one. What important lessons from our historical past are in play today? And what suggestions do you have in relation to combating modern day lynching?
Well, you know, the Honorable Reverend Al Sharpton teaches anyone, that demonstration without legislation is just demonstrating. You're just marching. You're getting the stress off your chest. You're being heard. You're shouting. You're with the group. But if the laws are not changed, then you're just in the demonstration phase of us going for freedom, justice, equality, and power. So the legislation is where the master challenge is. Trying to get somebody like Matt Getz to change his mind, or this person out here in West Virginia, you're trying to get them to change their minds through the legislation. So that brings me back to the young people, because it's going to be young, new, fresh, strong politicians that are not going to go in and get compromised. You see so many people that start off with you in the marches. You know, their head is right, their heart is right, they talk right, you vote them in, they get in. I can't tell you what happens. I can only say that something and sometimes happens. There's a lot of compromise today in US politics. To me, we're not even dealing with politics. This is politricks. What we are experiencing is not politics. It is not governed by law and moderate behavior or what is to be expected. People are playing games. People are making deals. People are bribing. Lobbyists are being bought. This is what we deal with every day under the umbrella of democracy. This is no democracy. We need to overhaul, for an example, the prison system. That's going to take new people. You can't put a man or a woman inside of a cage, a brick cage called solitary confinement. Leave them there for 12 years, a human being. Leave them there for 7 years, 3 years, and longer, and expect them to be rehabilitated. The system that we live in today is racism, white supremacy. It rules. It is the system we are under. And that entire system, as taught by the late, great queen herself, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, that system has 9 areas of people activity. And one of those areas, of course, is this politricks. So don't think that we have politics. You can't even, you see all of this crazy stuff every day, whereas the opposition is attempting to get people to, if you stand in line and you give somebody some water, you can be arrested. It's insanity. We are dealing with insanity. And the only way that we can sweep it out into nothingness is to get young people like the Alderman, the other gentleman that's on here, and anybody listening that fears God. When you talk about fear, if they're doing the things they're doing, with no fear to God, when God commands us to fear him, he says it's the pathway to wisdom. So if you have people in powerful positions, they have powerful influence, they ain't thinking about God. We are witnessing that every day. And Donald Trump was the greatest example of how far a person can go, sweeping God out of the way, utilizing this human power, if you will. And we are in the position that we are in today. So young people, you're running, stay moral, stay fearful of God, to his command, and stay true, stay honest. Is it hard to be honest? Is it hard to be human and all of the good virtues that we are raised with? It's not hard. All we have to do is put it into practice. You're going to meet the opposition, meet it then, so that we can bring in government and have politics and not the politricks that we are witnessing, living, and experiencing today.
Thank you, Ms. Nia 2X. Before you go, Ms. Gray, Alderman Grace, she mentioned your name, and then Ashanti jumped in right after him. It's interesting, she was talking about politics, and there's some people that feel the government does not work and benefit for Black folks. Some just don't see it. So you explained some of it, sir, but talk about specifically why you jumped in, and then Ashanti, summarize your interest in going into as a state delegate, please.
Well, I represent a ward in the city of Annapolis that is predominantly African-American. I'm talking like 88%. And of those communities, a majority of them are public housing communities, which you often don't think about when you think of the city of Annapolis. And so we're talking of families that have lived in desperation for decades, some of which in public housing that was built in the 1950s. We just had renovation on the second oldest public housing units in the country in Newtown 20. And so understandably so, people are frustrated in government. But to Nia 2X's point, what I often remind my friends is look at who has been elected over the course of the time when we grew up, and now look at who's being elected. I don't think it's by no mistake that, you look at Greensbelt and Collins there. You've got, people like Qiana Smith-Brown, who just ran in Annapolis in Ward 3 at 25. Ashanti's jumping in his race. Just so many young people here in the state of Maryland, and particularly African-American males, which makes me extremely excited because it shows that we really do care about our communities and that we really do want the just change. And I think that, again, the reason that I promote people not giving up on the political system or, electing officials that could potentially speak for your interests, because it really does boil down to what can you do with the resources that are given to a municipality. And you can be one voice in a room of 8 to say, okay, look, maybe we don't need to give this $500,000 to our detention center on Jennifer Road. Maybe we could take this $500,000 and put it into Annapolis Middle School so that they can have a change in engineering program or a VOTEC program. It's those little things that really do make a difference in our growth and development as a people. And it boils down to the two things, economic and academic growth. And I think we can fundamentally change those things. And that's why I really do promote, being engaged in politics.
Before the Ashanti.
Yeah, I think the Alderman spoke to a lot of the same reasons why I do this work. In my race, I'm running against an incumbent who has been in office for over 30 years. But if you ask around in the district, they can't really tell you what her name is or what she's done for us lately. And so for me, I'm in this race because our working families deserve so much more from Annapolis. Maryland is one of the wealthiest states in the wealthiest nation. But yet, if you go to certain parts of my district, you wouldn't be able to distinguish that from some parts of Baltimore City or some of our other really distressed parts of the state. And that's unacceptable in my opinion. I think there's so much that we could be doing with such a large Democratic supermajority for working people if that's the party who we are. I think we have to go to these places of power and really demand that we do so much more for our communities. And also, I just see that like folks with my background, my lived experiences aren't at the policy table. And so how can our policymakers make decisions when they don't understand what it's like to live from a marginalized perspective or what it's like to be at the ground level for simple things? I'm not just talking some of our granular policies, but understanding what it's like to not fully fund public transportation, not having roads that are equitable for all means of transportation, what it means to not be able to put food on your table, and how we can provide local nonprofits with refrigerators and food access, and what does that look like to not be able to meet ends meet, have rental assistance not come through, and now you have a management company or a landlord down your neck trying to get you to pay money that you can't pay. Or we have tenant holding over rules in the state where you can be evicted for simply not having your lease renewed for no reason. We don't have just cause evictions. There's so many loopholes and to Ms. Nia's point, politics that happen in our state that are all policy decisions. So why not step up and become a policy maker and right a lot of those wrongs and provide solutions that reduce harm that's caused to our communities?
I don't think we can end this conversation without giving voice to the very real disdain and discontent of people who are not invested in politics. And I'm from PG County. I grew up on Central Avenue and Shady Glen Drive in Capitol Heights. And I am very clear that in the predominantly Black political ecosystem that is PG County, many of the Black elected officials have sold poor Black people down the river. I am very clear that my skin folks ain't my kin folks in PG County, and even where I live in Baltimore City, that the handouts, the kickbacks, the attraction to power that has come with elected office has created a talented 10th mentality that keeps getting played out. And so I don't want to leave this conversation saying just vote. I think that is a politically impotent and right now disrespectful thing to say to Americans, to young Black Americans, to Black people. I think that we need a political agenda that speaks to the least of us. And that is what we lack in this country. That's what we lack in this county. We lack a political agenda that takes into account the needs of queer and trans and disabled Black people, the needs of poor Black people, the needs of Black people who have been repeatedly incarcerated by the Black political body, right? Like Black police chiefs and Black cops that keep brutalizing Black people as historically known in PG County. So this ain't just, I feel it in my spirit. So I'm sorry that I had to jump in with this, but I actually think that we need to retool the way we talk about this and talk about what does it mean for us to have a true participatory governance? What does it mean when young people should be able to make decisions about their schooling and about money going to their schools? And I'm not talking about 18-year-olds, I mean 14-year-olds. I'm talking about what does it mean for people who are undocumented to be undocumented, right? To be able to actually participate in the place that they call home. They are locked out of the political process. That is unjust and evil. And so until we can actually start to have conversations, not just about Black folks or young Black folks may or may not, I may not align with you politically, but I do think that it is disrespectful to just tell people to participate without naming all of the reasons that we are disengaged right now. And I say this as a person who's voted in every election since I was 18, who stood at Central High School with my mother while she voted all of my life. I think there's more to this.
Yeah, I agree to that. Oh, I just want to respond really quick, Ms. Nia. I do agree to that, but I do understand that we live in reality. And we have to understand too that our systems require us to participate if we want something to be produced out of it. And so as much as I understand all of those elements, I mean, I sit at the margins and the intersections of all types of places and spaces. I'm not your traditional of anything. And I'm not using me as a sole example, but just as one example to say, look, we have to step up and be involved and understand all of the things that you just illustrated as well when we get to those positions of power, so we don't repeat the politics of the past. There are good individuals who have really good intentions, doing this work and should be uplifted and acknowledged by all the people that have the critiques and the worries that you say, that exist. Those are true things that exist, and we have to acknowledge it and we have to speak to it. So I appreciate you bringing that up. But to say that it gives an excuse or a credence to not participate, not vote, not register, not be involved, to me is a disgrace to all the people that fought to make sure that we have those abilities to be part of these systems, to make them better. It takes all of us in order to see the society that we want to see, and we have to be part of that.
And absolutely, you're right. Both of you are right. But one main part that we're missing is the lack of education to the masses that are in the street. Pookie and them are shooting dice on the corner. Those are votes. Somebody else looks worthless. Well, let's just say they got their pants hanging down and that crowd. Those are votes, but they're not educated on the system. They have already made up my mind. That's a bunch of junk. It's a waste of time. So a lot of the work has to be put into going into the ranks and educating them, informing them about the power that they hold in that one vote. 10 of them, those are 10 votes, 100. Those are votes that can turn the community. I'll be honest with you. I was one of them. I just gave up on the system. I couldn't believe why people were still going to vote. I didn't see changes. And it wasn't until recently when we had a Black president that it made me turn my head to take a second look. And from really paying attention, believe it or not, I found out about the power in the local votes versus the national vote, because I didn't stop to take my time. I had put my fingers in my ears. I don't want to hear no more. I don't even know why y'all doing it. And that's where the masses of our people are. If we can engage, if we can go as soldiers into the streets without giving up, set up some type of campaign to get them to quickly understand that local power that you're holding, you'll get their attention. And that was proved in our chapter under the leadership of Sister Linda Perkins. She went into the hood. She waved all the smoke out of her face. She went to them. And at first they told her they didn't want to hear it. They kept shooting dice. But she said, give me 2 minutes of your time. And she was able to use that tactic, that strategic way, and was able to register 55 to 60 people who were grown adults that had not registered a day in their life. They listened and began to understand. So as we move, we have to be patient, determined, and persistent to educate those that like somebody did me and got my fingers out of my ears. Well, I really listened. And once I listened, I began to understand. And then I got into the ranks to swell the ranks so that the votes do count to get people in like you young men and women are running. They will vote for you if they understand. And it comes from an educational campaign.
Just two things very quickly. If you are formerly incarcerated, you can vote in the state of Maryland. Just tell your aunties, cousins, all of them. And that is due to policy, right? So I don't want to undermine the importance of policy. It was policy that disenfranchised formerly incarcerated people. And if you are in jail, not prison, but if you are in jail and you have not been convicted, you can vote. And you should be demanding to vote if you are incarcerated in jail. And so I want to just make sure that people know, people who are formerly incarcerated in the state of Maryland have the right to vote. So tell your people.
That's good.
And yes, local power. Locals are where it's at.
Ms. Master, that was touching on that question. I was literally touching on that because there was policy that was passed. I think Senator Corey McCray was pushing it, but actually Nicole Hansen with
Nicole Hansen-Mundell, yep.
Mundell, yep, thank you. So I'm not lying, but she had talked about pushing that part of it and pushing the State Board of Elections to make sure they implement and follow a policy that shouldn't even have to be written when it's allowed anyway. So I was going to mention that as to touch on about a policy question. And Mr. Graves, I'll start with you, sir. I need to hear from you for a minute. I want to make sure you summarize this question from an education perspective. Now, I saw this mentioned in the chat from, I hope I pronounced his name right, Peter Rickus, and mentioned about qualified immunity, hot button topic. And there are laws, any laws in Maryland that you see that should be passed to combat modern day lynching, such as qualified immunity. And if you have not paid attention, right next door in Virginia, Glenn Youngkin has came out and said he will ensure to protect qualified immunity. He said it on record already. So, Mr. Graves, you could start from that education perspective on how that, in terms of qualified immunity for police officers, some could look at it as a connection of, if it's a form of modern day lynching, and then Ms. Master, and then Ashanti, you can go ahead after her, please.
Yes, let me try to answer it by giving two perspectives. Number one, I think it's important for us to understand when it comes to mass incarceration, as people like Dr. Brian Stevenson talks about with Justice Initiative, we have to understand that mass incarceration and lynchings are interconnected. They're both forms of terrorism. But then going into qualified immunity being supported so that officers get away with murder, literally, that is always going to be connected to the legacy of slavery, because many of these laws are based in Black slave codes. It's really important. That's why I mentioned earlier, and we've all been on the same page. It's really important for our students to understand that they have to know the history of American experience for African Americans when it comes to the slave codes, because the police were developed from that basis, developed in order to investigate communities who they felt were a threat because they were exercising their freedoms. Those things did not get separate. Those things were always interconnected. And many are trying to have a conversation. They're trying to have a conversation about qualified immunity without going into the history of Black slave codes, saying this is a form of enslavement. Yes, we have forms of abolition, but we still have forms of enslavement that are happening. Convict leasing, when it came to freeing African Americans, they changed the rules of the game by saying you'll be free legally unless you're deemed a criminal. And then they started to lock people up for foolishness. You don't have a job? Well, you're now guilty of vagrancy, or vagrancy. They locked them up. And they started to target people and then try to say, well, it's legal, when they were just doing another form of, they were doing a form of neo-enslavement. And those conversations tend to be pushed out of debates when it comes to police reform, or as I'm assuming many of us have heard, the conversations about defund the police. I know from several activists in the front lines, they've said clearly, we're not saying that all officers, including African-American officers, should be removed. What we're saying is, whatever happened to redistributing funds in order to bring care and stability to African-American communities, what we're seeing is a consistent policing of our bodies and a training people to think that being Black is criminal. And then having laws put in place that don't really go to the root of this whole system that asks it necessary. Again, all this is interconnected, and we have to bring that to bear as educators. And unfortunately, we tend to focus only on one form of activism. We tend to focus solely on getting the police officers in jail, but we don't actually talk about why the entire system is in place to begin with. Does that make sense what I just conveyed?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Master, go right ahead, ma'am.
I'm sorry, can you restate the question one more time, Mr. Ford? Oh, you're on mute. Can't have a Zoom without somebody being on mute.
No. Sorry about that. I'll summarize it this way. Are there any laws you think Maryland should pass to combat modern day lynching, such as qualified immunity?
Yeah, so, okay, let's run them down. So one, truth and reconciliation with reparations. And I mean money. I mean reparations in telling the truth. I mean reparations in education. I mean reparations in public monuments. All of that. Absolutely defunding police just across the board. For me, defunding police is one step to abolishing them altogether. They cannot exist in the world that we are building. That I really love some of the work that's happening with juvenile justice. So not building new jails, so stopping like a moratorium on jail building, including youth jails, and decreasing the population. So mass release is something that we at Life After Release have been advocating for, and even went as far as to sue the Prince George's County Jail for, because they were consistently incarcerating people at the height of COVID, contributing to community spread and not providing incarcerated people PPE or any of the things they would need to live with dignity. And so we are big fans of clemency for people who are in prison, especially our elders or people who have served long sentences. We are certainly advocates of not having any young people talk to police without a lawyer and adult present, or other things that we can do. And then massive investments like this CARES Act money that mayors and elected officials are giving to police when we literally have communities in need. We have people experiencing homelessness. We have young people without the technology they need. We have schools. My partner's a teacher in Baltimore City Public Schools, and their school didn't have heat. And they had to close because the school didn't have heat. And the police in Baltimore City just got $41 million. We don't like that. And so we are absolutely invested in the types of policy that reduce prison populations, that deeply invest in Black communities, that provide young Black people with not just the educational resources, but the communal experience resources. So libraries, museums, classes, extracurricular activities, daycare and living wages. Those are all things that we can invest in tomorrow as community members that would combat modern day lynching, in addition to ending qualified immunity, in addition to making the Brady List in Prince George's County public. The Brady List is a registry of cops who have been caught lying in charging documents, and there are tons of them. And what we see is these cops lie when they're charging folks, because a statement of charges is just what the cops say you did. It doesn't actually mean what you did. It's just what the cops say. And so then they lie on people and in order to overcharge them so that people take a plea. And we want all of the cops who've been caught lying to be like, community members need to know. So we want a public Brady List. That's another thing we can do to end modern day lynching. And that's legislation, and that's what we've been pushing. State's Attorney Aisha also, State's Attorney Aisha Braveboy to release is her Brady List, and also to lower the bar for cops to get on it. So right now, I think in PG County, there are only like less than 20 cops on it, but we know way more cops are lying about people. And so we want to lower the bar of what it takes to make that transparent and visible to communities. So people can't go from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. They can't go from PG to Annapolis or PG to Montgomery County, or, Baltimore to Pennsylvania, consistently displaying the types of behavior. So all of those things, like we can do all of, and actually what I believe is that we can do all of that. Like we can do it. We just have to tell the people in power that we will not continue to allow you to have power if y'all don't do what we say we want you to do. And like, to me, that's where the voting, that's where the direct action, that's where the organizing is super important. I'm sorry, y'all, I got a whole lot of things that we can do to end modern day lynching.
I got you. I'm gonna make sure Ashanti jumps in. You were ready to roll. I saw it. Ashanti, go ahead and jump in, man.
No, I wish I could just regurgitate everything that Ms. Masters just said, because it is so important. Outside of this, the qualified immunity part, I think we all agree that police officers should be held liable and criminally accountable for any killings that they produce in our community. We don't get to go to work and cause harm without any type of repercussions. It's ridiculous that they have a certain standard that is not the same for the rest of us. But to Ms. Masters' point about the CARE dollars and the American Rescue dollars and the investment that has to our community, or what it could be. But what we're seeing around the country is that a lot of those local governments, where we talked about a lot of that power is held, are giving that money to police departments because they have to find a way to spend it by the Treasury deadlines. And so being engaged in the budgetary process, Prince George's County will be starting our budgetary process in March. I know the county executive is rushing to finish up the budget internally with agencies. There will be public hearings. Let's tell our council, let's tell our leaders exactly what we want to see. Annapolis, there is a $2.5 billion budget surplus. You know, in the beginning of the pandemic, we did not think we were going to be in an economic position that we're in, yet we're here. And there's so much that we can do to make our communities better, to reduce the harm that our systems are inflicting on our people. And I'm just so excited about what's on the horizon. That's actually $6 billion. Thank you. Yes, $6 billion rainy day fund. That type of money, if we can strategically invest it for childcare, we're talking about paid family leave. We're talking about making sure that individuals don't go hungry, reducing school debt. There are still kids that go to school today and can't afford to eat lunch because they have debt. This is Maryland, folks. This is 2022. We've got to do so much more just to reduce the interactions that individuals have with police. Why are police in an age of AI and technology still doing traffic stops? You know, there's so much that we can do to reduce harm, and that's what we got to be focused on.
And you know, another thing that we are sleeping on, and we should stop sleeping on it, is the major connection in media. Now, if media knew, well, let's say they do know, if media reported what Miss Masters just ran down, if the masses of the people, these are conversations we'll be having in the home, at the grocery store. This is the modern talk. But what do we talk about? We talk about what media talks about. Of course, they're going to talk about the pandemic, but they sway your thinking in the direction that a lot of the issues are important. But even more important was just the 7 and 9 bits of information she just shared that was very powerful, that could also go toward life-changing events. It's the media that smothers the voices, and it has it like small pockets of people are talking about A, B, C, and D, when we, the masses. Now, from the media, that's the economic component, because if we don't purchase certain media or take our money to certain media or make demands on them, we don't want to hear about all of this all the time. We want to hear about that. This is a very orchestrated monopoly, or whatever they want to call it. They basically control our thinking, because all of us should be talking about what Ms. Masters just laid out. It's all solution oriented, and it moves us from Wednesday to Thursday. But they have us going in a circle, talking about the same thing we talked about last month or last year, wasting time when they meet together in the boardrooms and make major decisions that infect many, many, many families, local, national, and we should think about that, because what she just laid out was just information that we all need, and we could take them to the potential voters.
Thank you, man. Alderman Gregg, it's terms of solutions, got a question for you, sir. In regards to how you just go on social media, you see some of these Amy Coopers, these Karens of America, who put a camera in someone's face and they just start screaming and may not understand they're placing Black people in peril, especially when they call the police. Should such behavior from you as an elected official be considered a misdemeanor crime of racial harassment? And if not, should we advocate for a racial harassment law to be considered as a misdemeanor? Please.
Yeah, I absolutely think it should be. And we actually tried to pass the legislation in Annapolis and it failed. But I totally agree. Just because it's a waste of resources, it puts in jeopardy the life of the individual who 9 times out of 10 did not commit an act that typically negates the type of response that they get in terms of police brutality. And so I totally think it should be passed. New York has done such as introducing legislation in their council. And I think that's something that should be mimicked across municipalities if states don't feel it necessary, which typically with issues like that, states don't get engaged. So it would have to be something that's done on a local level. I think now is the time, really, you know.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Greaves, go right ahead, sir.
I just had one quick question as a consideration, because In regards to a previous statement that was made earlier about how everyone should be involved, while I agree with that, and I believe 100% that participation matters, it is important to understand what the barriers are that keep participation from actually playing out. Because in many cases, even with voting, for example, you still have voter restriction that happens. And what voter restriction looks like, many are not aware of how that can play out. For example, there are elders that I've met who have said when they went to vote in different places, the laws were changed where they were not allowed to do electronic voting, and they had to show up the spaces. But the spaces they were asked to vote at were 2 or 3 hours away from where they worked. Whereas for predominantly white communities, they could do not just electronic voting, but vote at a local space that was 30 minutes away and be in and out. And so, of course, people could say afterward, well, voting suppression doesn't happen. You guys are just lazy. You guys should be involved more. That has been said, by the way. But the elders who were involved in the Black freedom struggle have noted at several points, they are changing the ways that they keep us from being involved. And we saw what this was like back in the 60s, 50s, and 40s. And the young adults are discouraged from getting involved nowadays because they feel that no one is telling them practically how to actually be involved in the system beyond simply voting and going into positions of going to governmental positions. They need to know some of the tips and the tricks that people have used to suppress them. And this goes back to my point with education. I put a link in here earlier in regards to some of the people that did critical work with multiple organizations, from SNCC to LCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Many of these grassroots organizations got practical work done because they understood the importance of community grassroots libraries. They understood, for example, in school systems, that the average student is not going to know about what voter suppression looked like. They would not know about what happened with terrorism, including intimidation of communities, so that they did not show up and get involved. And those things are critical as well. Even if schools are not teaching history today, it really is important for communities to be given prominent spaces to portray in the media what they're doing. And this is also important because for older generations who have knowledge, instead of using the newspapers like Ida B. Well did back in the day to raise awareness of lynching, they're using Instagram, Twitter, what's the other one, TikTok now, and Facebook to tell the stories of what happened. They're also finding out that creatives, Black African-American Black creatives, they're constantly being silenced on social media. And so as a result, you have people saying, well, we need to get more done because clearly no one's really participating. When what's happening is that there is a coordinated effort to ban and restrict Black activists, community activists, civic activists from actually being heard. Those algorithms are not accidental. And I just had someone today that went through that process. She was raising awareness for Black History Month on how African Americans did voter registration, specifically Black women. And she was banned from Facebook for something as silly as saying, we feel that you are a community disturbance. She thankfully screenshotted what happened, but she made clear as an educator in the Maryland school systems, she said, it's important for creatives to have their stories told so that people don't feel patronized as if they're not doing enough. And we have to start creating media spaces on a grassroots level so that the stories don't get dismissed. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Mr. Rick. Before anyone jumps in, there was a few Q&A questions I want to make sure I get to real quick. I'll start with the top, but Melissa Holland mentioned something that Ms. Masters already mentioned in regards to reparations. She's part of an organization of that, at fundforreparationsnow.org. And Ms. Sandra Davis had a question that Mr. Greaves, this may be right toward you, sir, and anybody else. Any thoughts on how artists, and you mentioned creatives, have been involved in telling this story nationally or locally? And once you answer, I'll get to the next question.
All right, if you can hear me. One thing that we've seen with artists and creatives is that they're using poetry and the arts in order to tell their stories. Of course, with dealing with those algorithms, they've had to create their own platform. So while Facebook has been beneficial, Instagram included, it's important to create their own websites and audio, podcasts in order to get these stories out there. Also, a little trick of the trade, one thing that artists are doing and activists are using the commons, the public commons. That means your local library. And if you use your local libraries and partner with them to get education out there with anti-racist, with a curriculum that focuses on addressing racism through anti-racism education. When you do those things, you can get your information out there in a more public manner. Many of them are also partnering, thankfully, in school systems as well, when it comes to using poetry and the arts to convey these historical stories of African-American experience, because art is a huge way of expression for the young adults today. Many are realizing as well, because of history education, they're realizing that the arts were always critical when it came to the freedom struggle. There were artists who were singing songs, like this James Brown, I'm Black and I'm Proud. I forget the name of the artist. She sung the song, Dancing in the Streets. I love that song, but she sung that after a prominent riot in Detroit. And the songs and the musicology was a way of helping the creatives to tell the story of the struggle. So partnering with local schools is a critical way of encouraging young creatives that art is a way to get their stories out there.
Thank you, sir. I'm gonna go to this next question. This from Caitlin Atkins. She mentioned she's a high school teacher and is still working to effectively teach many of these subjects, not only lynching, but the ubiquity of Black resistance to racial violence, etc., when many of my students have not been exposed to them in their previous years of schooling. With the thought of taking action and not only talking about issues, what do you think are the most important things that high school sophomores and juniors can do today? Anyone want to jump in?
Definitely, you have to educate them on Black history, not just in February. You can't teach Black history in 28 days. You have to, as an educator, you have to incorporate in your teachings something that empowers the student to understand the beauty of being Black, the privilege of being Black, the honor of being Black, instill an understanding of pride of being Black and how much you have contributed to civilization. That civilization would not be as advanced as it appears without the contributions of many Black people. You can make it fun. You can have it intellectual or any way you want to, but you want them to participate. The more questions they ask, you're making your point, but certainly do it. And there's information everywhere, from the discoveries of the mailbox. Black man made the mailbox. And we know about the traffic light and the other inventions. Now, recently, I don't know if it's true, they say the lady named Miss Childs, Childs, she was the one that made the chicken that old Colonel Sanders bit into, and the rest is history. But they say the lady died in obscurity. She died poor, but her name, and I have to research it. Just because I heard it doesn't make it true. I've always known old Colonel ain't make that chicken. I just didn't know who he had got that chicken, the recipe from. But there are many examples of society today. So you can start with inventions because you're telling the truth and it makes the student more curious. Well, if we did these 20 things, what other 25 things have we done? So start with telling the truth about the inventions from the minds of Black men and women.
I just want to shout out a couple of organizations who are doing really dope work in the DMV. One is Black Swan Academy. And I'll drop the links as I find them, but Black Swan Academy is a collective of young people, young Black girls who are high school and middle age, doing a beautiful work around police-free schools, which is like really making my heart really, really happy, led by Samantha Page Davis. Collective Action for Safe Spaces is another space, teaching young people and adults about catcalling and interventions. I also want to shout out the work of places like Good Kids Mad City in Chicago. They also have a chapter in Oakland. Baltimore Youth Baltimore Youth March. It's some young folks who decided, like, they started taking action during the 2020 uprisings. Young people are literally in the streets leading marches, leading actions, leading demonstrations, demanding that their voice be heard. There's also some really beautiful legislation coming up. I know this is specific to Baltimore, but around like student governance, right? And like the role of students on the boards of education are things that young people, I think, in this moment can really get involved in, especially having more autonomy, having more voting power. If they are a student liaison to the Board of Education where they're in their jurisdiction. And so I'll continue to drop links, but there are some, in Project Nia, shout out to Miriam Kaba, an OG abolitionist with the likes of Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Angela Davis, has Project Nia in Chicago, which was a space for young people to start to organize around anti-incarceration efforts, because we know, like, at places like the Boulevard, when it was still the Boulevard, or Iverson Mall, when young people are hanging out, that's when they're also targeted by police. And so places like also Smile is local to the DMV, serving and mentoring youth advocates and leaders. And so there are several organizations nationally and locally doing really dope work to help young people organize, to make demands of the adults, and to build power so that they can take action now.
Yeah, I want to also.
Ashanti, I see you jumping in. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to also uplift the work that we're doing at PG Changemakers for Police-Free Schools. We have a group of about 10 students that are really leading us in that work. And we're really excited to be partnering with organizations like the Advancement Project to really push for the advocacy of students on police-free schools. But I want to speak directly to the importance of the autonomy of students in their student governments. You know, I got my start as a high school sophomore around 14, volunteering with the Young Democrats in the county, getting involved with the Prince George's County Regional Associations of Student Governments, that then goes on and advocates for the county at the Maryland Association of Student Councils, who then has the authority to appoint someone to the state Board of Education. There's a student member that's voted on by students. Our Board of Education in Prince George's County is voted on by the representatives from all of the schools that participate within PGRAS, which is our regional association. So there's so much learning, so much experience that you can get from those opportunities, where, you know, you have your guardrails and you get to talk about the issues that are impacting you and your fellow classmates. But I wouldn't be here on this webinar if I didn't have those opportunities and I didn't have teachers and advisors really pushing me to be in those spaces. You know, I was one of those kids that always had talks too much on his report card. But I luckily had educators that understood this person's going to be a leader and let's show them how to be a leader in this way. And so I think you even asking those questions is a good indication that you have the best intentions for your children. And I hope, you know, they'll come work with us at PG Changemakers and all the other organizations that Ms. Masters brought up.
Parks and Planning, by the way, has a lot of amazing work that goes on when it comes to education. Omar Martinez has been a really crucial voice on the front lines. I've been blessed to work with him with the Prince George's African American Museum and Cultural Center on several occasions. And one event that happened was with another international organization called the Slave Dwelling Project. Very crucial organization that I encourage all young adults and older adults to get involved in, because what they do is they go around the country to the spaces where African Americans were enslaved, and they tell their stories. For example, at the Marietta House Museum last year, I was able to go to their discussions, and it was really critical what they discussed. They mentioned how at that particular former plantation, when visitors would come through and they were being educated, they were only told the perspectives of the whites who were in charge of the plantation, but they never talked about what life was like for the enslaved on that ground. They didn't talk about the ways they had to resist, they had to maintain their culture. They didn't talk about the terror they lived under for fear of either being punished or killed for resistance. And it's important to get those stories out, because in the school systems, those stories are being actively suppressed. And so again, I mentioned all that to say that, again, Parks and Planning is an amazing space to check out. And any space that does work in regards to educational activism, can't be minimized. Another space to check out would be the Zen Education Project. I mentioned that because Howard, the Zen Education Project actually did an amazing job, not just honoring Howard Zinn, but taking the time to show what curriculum looks like when it includes the voices of Black and Indigenous people. They were one of the few spaces that went out publicly to name every single instance of racial terrorism in this country. When it came to, I believe what happened last summer in Tulsa, Oklahoma, with Black Wall Street, they talked about how there have been multiple Black Wall Streets and race riots that happened afterward. Those things were suppressed because, again, what you don't know, you can address. And so they made maps to show where people could see these things in detail. And they talked about the libraries to go to, the school systems to go to, and the educators who need support getting these stories out there. This is a critical opportunity when it comes to addressing racial terrorism, because you already have venues that are putting these stories out there. And instead of trying to recreate the wheel, it's important to get locked into what they're doing and bring it into our spaces here in Prince George's County and further.
Thank you. Alderman Gray, I want to make sure you got to jump. Is there any particular organizations that's going on there in Annapolis that you can share?
Definitely. I would just really highlight some of the programs that we're utilizing to try to change some of the unfortunate fates in our communities, like our Naptown Anti-Dope, which is a really unique organization that puts boots on the ground for our opioid crisis here in the city of Annapolis, that we're definitely making sure that we're funding, and piggybacking off of even some of the programs that Ms. Masters mentioned. Some of the strategic outreach that they utilize in other cities, just bringing back here. We do the same with our Naptown VIP program, which is our violence interruption program, and so forth. And so I would just continue to highlight those. We are currently in our budget process. If anybody's listening that has a nonprofit that serves the Anne Arundel or Annapolis area, you can apply for our community grants. We give away $450,000 every year. And so just please take advantage of those opportunities. And I'm sure the same is happening in Prince George's as the budget's being deliberated there ahead of our July 1st deadline. So definitely.
Thank you, sir. I wanted to make sure I get a couple more questions in. Let's see. Susan McCutcheon has two. And once I throw them out there, anyone can go ahead and answer. One question she asked, what about classism as part of the racism issue? And her second question she asked, do you mean no police system at all? What would you have replace addressing real crimes? So anyone else to jump in?
I've seen those in the chat and I was waiting on that. Those two in particular, because really two quick things I'm passionate about. As it relates to the, defunding the police, what was the messaging? Was that the best messaging that we could have used? Probably not, but does, it relate to exactly what we need? Yes. We need to completely revitalize our police department, as Ms. Masters suggested. And to me, does that mean removing all, criminal law enforcement? No, because if somebody runs up to me with a gun, I want to call the police, but I think that it also means changing how you engage and interact with communities. As Ashanti mentioned earlier, we're in the year 2022. We don't necessarily need to do traffic stops. And also when you respond to particular calls, one of the things that we're really pushing for and revitalization of our department here in Annapolis is ensuring that on every single call that relates to a domestic dispute, mental health crisis, a first responder is assisting a certified clinician. And so we're shifting our response from police to intervention, whether it be therapists or a clinician that can serve our communities better. And so that's, I think, and Ms. Masters, please, I almost called Jasmine, I'm so sorry. Correct me if I'm wrong as it relates to defunding, but just really quick also to the classism part. I think one of the greatest frustrations I found within classism in particular is within our own race. As we elevate and we climb the status of whatever profession that we're in. I think it's so important, and it's been mentioned here on this call so many times, that we go back and we help our communities. And we, invest and give back to those nonprofits that invested in us and that help really change our life and our look forward. I think that, to be selfish with funds, and particularly in times that we have now, is disappointing, and particularly with so many of our, I hate to use the word celebrities, or the figures that our youth find of importance. If they could find a way to invest back in us, I think that would go a long way as it relates to classism and the intersection of racism.
Ms. Max, before you jump in, I wanted to make sure that there was it was asked about if everyone on the panel could share the information in the chat while the conversation is being going on. And quick follow-up, Alderman Gray, when we mentioned about the police and reforming the structure of it, has there been some policies passed there in Annapolis to do such thing?
Yeah, so what we've done is we put together a really comprehensive piece of legislation to approach this police reform issue. And this literally happened right after the George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. Young people, including myself and my friends, were marching in the city of Annapolis for weeks and weeks and weeks. And behind the scenes, we were putting together, these are the initiatives that we'd like to see change. And so myself and my colleague, Alderman Rob Savage, and a number of other council members put together legislation implementing all of those ideas. It is currently up before the city council. We had to wait until October the 1st because the state had passed the Tons law and so forth. And we wanted to make sure that everything could really gel together. But yes, we have the legislation up. We completely will ban no-knock warrants within the city, using that within our scope. We plan to implement and bring in clinicians to assist with calls within the communities. And we already have up and running our Office of Community Services, which now fields any calls as it relates to circumstances of poverty. And so people don't necessarily need to pick up the phone and go to the police to handle those issues or feel obligated to engage with law enforcement. So really just letting our police and letting our social services do the social services.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Masters, go right ahead. I see you ready.
Oh, I am ready. Brother Gay, I hope we can connect more. It's also very difficult to type and talk at the same time, so I'll do my best to drop links. If you saw me looking up, I wasn't rolling my eyes. I was grabbing my book, We Do This Till We Free Us. It is a resource I highly, highly, highly suggest by Miriam Kaba. I also highly suggest Becoming Abolitionists by Derica Purnell and Abolition Feminism Now by Angela Y. Davis, like that Angela Davis, along with Beth Ritchie and another author. And so let's tackle classism first. I would like everyone to Google the term racial capitalism. And it is a term put forth by a Black scholar by the name of Cedric Robinson. And Cedric Robinson makes the case that it makes a thesis that I completely agree with, that it is actually capitalism so the greed manifested from capitalism that creates racism, that Black people are then used as an exploited commodity in order to enrich the white Christian masses. And so Cedric Robinson, as well as Walter Rodney, who wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, as well as the seminal text Black Marxism. And this is not my area of study, but I have been exposed to people who have done so much work around this, are really foundational texts to understanding the interconnection, the very deep interconnection between capitalism and racism and the creations of race. And I want to get on this defund the police, what happens in a world without police. So for me, I came out of the Black Youth Project 100 in the day George Zimmerman was acquitted. 100 Black young people, I was 24 at the time, were in Chicago. We had no idea the decision was coming down, and we wept. It was a very emotional moment for all of us. And we decided in that moment to build a political organization for young Black people, ages 18 to 35, that centered on what we called Black queer feminisms. And the reason we did that was because we saw that actually within the history of Black liberation movement, Black men had been at the center, whereas the labor of Black queer, trans people and Black women had either been treated as if it was supposed to be behind Black men or if it was invisibilized. And so we said, no, borrowing the histories of the Combahee River Collective, scholars like Audre Lorde and a whole bunch of folks from throughout history who were Black and queer. We said we want to make a political intervention to understand how do we take the margins, right? The margins of Black folks, and how do we put them at the center? And it is through that political lineage in 2013 is when this occurred, that we began to actually make the first demands around defunding, but the demand to defund the police is actually a 100-year-old demand. Because remember, the police are they're the state-based enforcement arm of enslavement. That's how they came to be. Mm-hmm. And so because of that, I do not think that the demand to defund the police was radical. I think it was just a very clear, very conscious demand. And we are not saying that the police are going to fall tomorrow. We know that's not what's happening. What I have said, what my comrades have said, what my contemporaries have said is that we need to create a new world, to create life-making institutions, and the police and prisons are death-making institutions. And the way we get to the new world is to reduce our reliance on police and increase our interdependence on each other, right? So I love when Mr. Martinez named civic clubs and block clubs. I love when PG Changemakers goes out and does mutual aid and jail support. I love when we at Life After Release are one of the anchor institutions for Free Black Mamas DMV, where we bail out Black mothers and caretakers who can't afford bail. And then we be like, okay, so y'all can't afford bail. We're gonna pay your bail, but we'll also give you housing. We give you $100 gift card. We have a fellowship that we'll put you in, and we give you $100 a week to participate in this fellowship for 8 weeks. You need a job. We'll see if we can get a job. How can we, as a community, reduce our reliance on calling the police on folks? Not that crime and harm won't happen, but it's that one, when crime and harm does happen and you call the police, if they show up, because some places they don't show up. Let's be very clear. If they show up, they take a statement, they may say sorry, and then nothing. What the police are doing is deeply ineffective. Like over half of the people, 1 in 10 sexual assailants is convicted. 1 in 10, 9 in 10 are not. So police aren't stopping rape. Baltimore City has like a 30% close rate, and they are wildly inflating those numbers. The police aren't stopping murders. The investment in police is not stopping carjackings. And so what we're saying is we need a broader menu of options, because the police as the only option is not working for our society. Right?
I'm sorry to interrupt. We got
no. I wanted to clear that up for folks. So like that's
just fine. That is absolutely fine. Each of you got to give your 2-minute closing. So Ms. Master, since you are already at the mic, you might as well help us go off, and then Ms. Nia 2X, because ladies should be first, and then whichever gentleman wants to go behind Ms. Nia 2X, go for it. Ms. Master, 2 minutes.
Grateful, just gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Ford, for moderating this conversation. Thank you to my fellow panelists for being brilliant. You can reach me as Samantha at lifeafterrelease.org. And let's continue to build the world we deserve to live in, where all Black people and all Black bodies are free of fear, harm, and we can thrive.
And I'd like to say in my 2 minutes, I am so encouraged when I hear young people talk as brilliant as all of the panelists are speaking tonight. I am a retired police officer, so I know it from the inside as well as being a citizen, and it truly needs to be defunded. And basically, the money needs to be reallocated, as we're saying, into better reasons to be spent. And most of us can agree with that. The classism is certainly connected to the racism. They just go hand in hand. The police look at different neighborhoods or different people. I worked with them, and I worked with them for 30 years, and I didn't ever get a promotion in 30 years because I was a rebel. And if I saw a homeless person on the street, you know, I'm not going to talk to him or her as if being homeless is a crime. There's some kind of story with it. But anyway, what the panelists are saying, it brings about a new day. Just stick with it, stay determined, stay faithful, and keep pushing. And before you know it, you'll look up and you'll have the world that you are visualizing and that we are working from our end. Not that we're old and antiquated, because we're not. I learned a lot tonight from everyone, and my main feeling is inspiration to know that those behind me, y'all got it going on, you're holding it down. Just when you get in, can I just ask you, please don't change and turn into something that you weren't here tonight. And thank you for having the Greater DC Chapter National Action Network. You can find us at www.greaterdcchapternan@gmail.com. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, I want to use my 2 minutes to answer the last bit of the questions, because I don't think folks realize how much classism is a tool of white supremacy. We see it so often, and especially in Prince George's County circles. We love to tout that we are the most affluent Black jurisdiction in the country, if not the world, but yet we also don't talk about how our poverty rate rivals that of Baltimore City, and our schools are just as low performing. Right? We don't talk about all of the underbelly that comes with being in Prince George's County because it feels good, and that's by design. A lot of the work that we've been doing at PG Changemakers, in particular with police-free schools, there's often this tone and conversation with folks that look like many of us on this call, that certain communities and certain schools need police, where others can police themselves. You have individuals and officials who send their kids to private schools, yet want to make sure that public schools don't have the resources, yet have armed officers walking the hallways as if they're jails, right? We have to be very honest about how classism destroys the solidarity that should be existing within our communities, because at the end of the day, we're all still Black people. To the point about the defund conversation, you know, as a candidate, but even before being a candidate, I never like to police the language of movements. You know, if the Democratic Party or other people that were affected by that didn't like that, then they should have come up with a different term. I think media has a big way of dictating the conversation, but you only can dictate a conversation if you have nothing to talk about, right? So we as a party have to do better with navigating our message and having something to deliver that people can actually vote on. Ultimately, though, it is a reality that crime is up across the country, but we're not talking about the unemployment that COVID has caused. We're not talking about the impacts of long COVID and how over 200,000 Marylanders are impacted from something that we don't know the long-term effects of. There are a lot of inequality that still need to be tackled. And so all that we discussed is really heavy, and it weighs on all of us. And so the last bit of advice, or something that I'm often trying to remind myself, is that there is still joy in this work, to be very much seeped in that, because that's what's going to sustain you. And so I really appreciated this. I really feel like, you know, there's so much solidarity in this space, and I'm just really happy to have connected with all of you tonight.
Great.
Alderman Gay or Mr. Gray?
Thank you very much. This was great, and it really did, re-energize me. I think oftentimes when we do work in public service, you are drained quickly. So to be able to have dialogue like this and know that there are people that are fighting the same fight that you are in different ways, it feels so good. And piggybacking off of what Nia 2X said, it makes it even better because we're all so young. And I know this could be a great future potential for the state of Maryland. I look forward to keeping in contact with each of you. Please let me know if I can help in any way here in Annapolis or within your individual jurisdictions. Can make myself available in any way. So I appreciate this time tonight.
Great. Is that it?
Now, Mr. Greaves, his 2 minutes.
I just have to give shout outs to every single person, not only who participated as a panelist, but those in the audience who listen, because showing up is the first line of defense at every single time of history when it comes to freedom struggles and hometown security. So really appreciate everyone showing up. And I have to say, I put a comment here in the chat briefly. Again, it's in regards to education because someone had asked earlier for resources. These are just things that you can use in your conversations. If you check out Decolonial Atlas, they have documentation for what we've been talking about with police brutality cases and all historical accounts of massacres of communities in U.S. history. Because what matters is that our kids and the generations upcoming know the stories.
That's right.
But the elders, before they pass on and take that knowledge, that library of knowledge with them, it's important that our children and our young adults get told accurate history. So I just want to share that. And I wanted to share one quick point regarding a post I saw. It was in regards, someone put up something in regards to Native Americans who enslaved African Americans. I just want to, I didn't find the link in time, but I want to say places like the Accokeek Heritage Foundation, I believe that's the name of it. They're doing critical work in regards to talking about the Native intersections. A colleague of mine, Shamika Berry, we did a discussion at the Prince George's African American Museum this past August with Omar E. Martinez as well. And we talked about why those intersections matter. Often when you're going through an experience, when African Americans were facing racial terrorism, there were parallel experiences with other non-white communities. And part of our resistance is showing how those things intertwined. And as we mentioned earlier, I'm glad that we talked about being complicit as well, because there were natives who were complicit in the slave trade. There were also natives who resisted. And for me, being Afro-Indigenous, it's important to know about the history of those who were mixed with both and who are part of this conversation as well. So, that's all I have to say. I appreciate you guys.
Okay, Mr. Ford, do you have any final remarks?
No, they summed it up. Thank you for allowing me to moderate. Appreciate it.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank each and every one of our panelists. We appreciate you. But one of the things I'd like to say, I hope that everyone learned something tonight from this webinar. All of the issues discussed tonight are rooted in historic lynching and slavery. And we need soldiers to help us combat modern day lynching and slavery. I'm imploring all of you in the audience there and our panels to learn where you came from by joining the Maryland Lynching Project, to action by joining the NAACP. Those who made this webinar possible, I thank each and every one of you. I thank those who have worked diligently to make it happen, such as Mr. Ford, our awesome moderator, Ms. Lewis Rosario, Austin DeMarco, Christina Tucker, Lula Beatty, and again, all of the panelists, because this wouldn't have been possible without you. I think it was an awesome conversation that we had. So again, I thank you all. And again, I would like to say, make it possible. Let's work towards, let's say, our freedom. We thought we had it, but in all actuality, we don't. So like as Nia 2X said, it takes all of you young people to make this happen. And some of us who has so little historic knowledge of it are 100% behind you. So with that said, again, I thank you all and thank you.
Is this going to be recorded? People are asking where they can see the recording.
Yes, it's on, I believe it's on YouTube. I think Austin probably can answer that question a little better, but it is being recorded. So I think we'll put it up on the NAACP website and I believe on the Lynching Project's website also. So with that being said, if there are no other questions, thank you all again. I can't thank you enough, and have a good evening.
Thank you.